Good morning, everyone. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and about verses 5 and 6, where we'll start this morning with our class. Good to have you here today. Let's begin our time today with a word of prayer, and we'll get started in 1 Corinthians. Heavenly Father, we're thankful for the day, for our blessings, for the safety that we've had thus far. We're thankful for the safety that we've had during the storms of late. We pray for those who were affected severely by it. Pray that you would bless us during this time of study, that we would get much out of the words that you have given to us. And it's in Jesus' name we pray. Amen. 1 Corinthians chapter 5. You'll recall from last time we began a new chapter, a new section, a new subject that Paul has been writing to the church here at Corinth. This is, we're going to call, for sake of notes or for titles of the section, we're going to call moral issues, because he deals with more than just the thing that we talked about last time. But you'll remember that Paul tells the church here at Corinth, just to get us up to about verse 6, that he has heard through a lot of individuals. Seems like that there was a lot of people that knew this information, that there was some immorality there, severe enough to where Paul was surprised by it. Even he said that some in the Gentile world would be surprised by it, that a man would have his father's wife there. And perhaps that's not the most shocking, perhaps that's not the most difficult thing that he's heard here. Perhaps the worst of it is the way that the church was handling it, or to say it in a different way, the way that the church was not handling it. And they seem to be very accepting and not wanting to fix the issue. We'll see some more of that today. But Paul was telling them how they should deal with it, and we were getting into that before our time ran out last time. We'll start around verse 6, even though I know that we've read some of this last time. I think about verse 8 is where we'll get started, but I did want to make sure that we understood some of the things here in verses 5 and 6, just for those who may have not been with us last time. So verse 5 tells us, Paul tells the church there what they need to do. One of the problems is that they were, as we see here in verse 6, that they were glorying in it. They were, I don't know if happy is the right word, but they were accepting of the situation, whatever the details were, and were not willing to fix it. We're not willing to do anything to change the situation. And so he tells them, verse 5, that they should have delivered such a one to Satan. That has nothing to do with any kind of damage physically here, but rather the person has already left spiritually. If I'm living in sin, regardless of where I am physically, I've already left God spiritually. So I can be sitting right next to you this morning, and if I'm living in sin, I'm not part of the church. I've left it. And so he's saying if that person is going to continue to live in sin, allow them to do that, just not in the presence of everyone else where they can affect other people. And he's going to say that, verse 6. And so here in verse 6, your glorying is not good. And this is perhaps more of an issue than the sin itself, because the sin of immorality and someone living with someone who is not his wife, that's certainly an issue for those two people and families that are involved there. But the bigger issue is how the church was handling it, in that they were glorying. They were excited about perhaps how loving they were about it. They were not wanting anyone to change. And so they're glorying in it. He uses the word not good. Philippians 1 verse 27, Paul told the church that they needed to let your conversation be as thus becomes the gospel of Christ. Our lives need to be as becomes Christians. The way that Christians live, the way that Christ lives, that's how we should live. And so that your life, let your conversation or your lifestyle be as such that becomes Christians or the gospel of Christ. And Corinth was certainly not doing that. And so what he's wanting them to do is they needed to change their attitude about it so that they could help these two people, and I'm certainly there were more involved there, but they could change the issue here with these two people and move on to other things. So he says, your glorying is not good there, verse 6. Do you not know, verse 6, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And this gets back to perhaps why the issue is so much bigger and broader than just two people living in an illicit relationship. Because if we allow sin to stay and no one cares anything about changing, no one does anything about it, it affects more people. Some have posited the idea that perhaps some were arguing that this is an isolated case. This is the private life of two people, and no one else should be concerned about it. And if that sounds more modern than ancient, well, we haven't changed. And so what two people decide to do, then we shouldn't be concerned about it. And to a certain extent, okay, especially those out in the world. I think that we spend far too much time belaboring over what the world is doing and what the latest trend in sin is in the world. And we've far too little time focusing on what we need to be focusing on, being faithful to God and making sure that we as a whole are doing as we should. But here in the church, though, this is the issue here. Again, this woman, perhaps, as far as we can tell, she probably wasn't even a member of the church. And it seems to be that the man was, and that's what Paul was focusing on. The world doesn't really know any better. The world's going to be what the world is. Paul's trying to focus on Christians here who have supposedly changed and made that great confession and obeyed the gospel. And so it's not just an isolated case. Sin affects everybody. So, what happened in Israel of old. After Jericho, God told them, don't take anything from the ruins. And Achan took some gold and silver, hid it in his tent. Not only that, but he buried it in the ground under his tent and put a rug on top of it. That's isolated. That's private. What happens in someone else's tent shouldn't really concern anyone. Well, it cost them dearly in the next battle. Sin does affect other people. And so certainly we certainly can take that too far, but the idea, it wasn't private is one thing here. This was public nature, so much so that Paul on the other side of the sea heard about it from people talking. So it wasn't private. This was something that was going to affect other people, and the lack of discipline, the lack of caring enough to try to change someone, that would affect others as well. Because if you don't care enough to help someone else do better, then you don't care enough about me. So why bother? Why do what's right, I guess? Because we're just going to float through things. And so a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Leaven, that leavening agent in dough, is used in a good way. Jesus talks about influence being something that's good. Here we see it as something that's bad. Influence is neither good or bad. It's what you decide to do with it that's good or bad here. And so it has that effect on others. And so that's perhaps a bigger issue than the sin itself. And so sometimes our reaction to sin, either for good or bad, is bigger and far more reaching than the sin itself. I think we read verse 7, but is there anything there for verse 6 anybody wants to bring up? All right, here verse 7, purge out the old lump. Therefore the old lump, that you may be a new lump, and you are unleavened, for even Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. Sometimes when you're reading Paul's writings, he'll use an image, and we've seen a whole bunch of images up to this point, master builder and all these other things. Sometimes he'll start with an allusion to something or an image, and then he'll continue for several sentences with that metaphor and with that image. And here he does that as well. So he talks about a little leaven. Don't you know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? And then he uses that image into the next verse. Purge out the old leaven. Take that sin that's there, that influencing agent for bad, take it out, and notice what you'll become. You'll become a new lump. You'll become brand new. If we would care about change for other people, other Christians, ourselves as well, of course, and make sure that we are doing as we should, it'll be like we are a new church, a new lump, a new, whatever the image is there that you want to look at. Care enough that you want others to be better. Care enough that if you were in sin, you would want someone to come to you and say, we want you to change, we want you to be here. Again, the point here is they're not kicking someone out. They don't have this attitude that they are shunning someone to the point where, that's the ultimate goal. The ultimate goal is to get the person to want to be part of that new lump again. They're glorying, they're accepting, they're, desiring to just everybody be okay with everybody. That was not good, Paul said. You're an old lump, and that leavening agent has influenced others, and so you need to take out what's the cause of it, and then you can be a new lump, that person included. And as we've said, 2 Corinthians lets us know that more than likely that this did take place and that man had come back and repented and changed. And that's exactly what the point was here. And he uses as well this idea of a new lump bread, leavening agent, unleavened bread, this sort of thing. And he also brings in the idea of Jesus here being our Passover, who was sacrificed for us. Chapter 16, verse 8, if we'll go to the very end of the book, there's just a few words there that he mentions. But chapter 16, verse 8, Paul talks about waiting in Ephesus until Pentecost. Some people think that means that that's where he is when he's writing this, Ephesus. And it says that he will wait until Pentecost, which was 50 days past Passover. So more than likely, he was there in Ephesus at Passover when this was going on. Not that he was partaking of the Passover as he normally did as a Jew. He's a Christian, and the Jewish feast no longer had any binding on him. But he was still aware of those feasts, and he still used them to his advantage, especially to convert Jews, to the church. And so perhaps even at this moment when he's writing this, Passover is on his mind, especially all of those years when he would partake of it as a Jew. And so he talks about Christ here being our Passover. Sometimes because it's very easy to do this, sometimes we take the Passover with the unleavened bread and some of these other things, and we try to make that a shadow or a type of Jesus, of the Lord's Supper. The unleavened bread. Well, we take unleavened bread, and Jesus instituted the Lord's Supper at the time of the Passover there, and the feast that they had with the fruit of the vine, the unleavened bread. So sometimes we take the Passover and we equate it with the Lord's Supper. But here Paul lets us know that's not it. Just because it took place at Passover and he used the same elements, that's not the same thing. And there's certainly not an equals between the two. Jesus is our Passover. Remember what happened in the book of Exodus for the Passover? They were to eat that feast with their shoes on, standing up, ready to go, and that death angel would pass over them because they had obeyed the gospel. Moses told them, the death angel's coming. The firstborn of each house is going to die unless you take the blood of that lamb, that spotless lamb, and you put it over the doorposts. The bad news was people are going to die. The gospel, the good news was you can save yourself by obeying the words of the prophet. Do what he says and you'll survive. And so the death angel passed over them. Jesus is our Passover lamb. And so those who obey the gospel, the bad news is sin, the wages of sin is death. The good news is, the gospel is those who obey the words of the prophet, God himself, Jesus here on this occasion, and take the blood of the lamb and apply it to their lives over the doorposts there, the death angel passes over them. And so to connect the point that he's making here, they're not obeying the gospel. They're not obeying the words of Jesus here in their accepting of sin and allowing it to ferment and allowing it to influence everybody that's there. The gospel, or obeying the gospel, is not just a one-time act or something you do in a moment, but rather it's something that we continue to do. And so some of them had left off with that. And so it's like they put the blood over the doorpost and then they've removed the doorpost. And they need to continue to do that in order for the death angel to pass over them here. So he's connecting the two there. Jesus is our Passover. The Lord's Supper isn't the Passover. And it's not what Moses or God intended for it to equate to. Jesus is that blood that's there. And the feast that they had, certainly some elements connected to what we have today in the Lord's Supper because they were incidental, but the Passover here is typified with Jesus, not the Lord's Supper. I thought I'd mention that as we were here in this section, verse 7. Anything there, verse 7? He tells them, purge out the old leaven. Leaving sin in your midst is much worse, but it's the same as in the old law if they would have had leaven in that bread or in that lump that they were to take during the Passover. And so the Jews here in Corinth, the former Jews, would certainly have understood the illustration and the meaning behind it, and leaving it in there would have been just as detrimental spiritually as it was supposed to be, or was going to be to them physically, if they didn't obey the law of Moses. All right, verse 8. Therefore, let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, neither with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. The feast here is not the Passover. He's not telling them that they need to keep the old law in any form, even with those feasts and that sort of thing. He's continuing with this illustration that he has started with in verse 6. That leaven that's supposed to be sin, that's influential. Take that out, remove that, and you'll be a new lump. Because Jesus is our Passover, and they could not eat that feast of the Passover unless they had put the lamb's blood over their doorpost. And so in that same way, you need to purge out sin, and then you can enjoy the feast to its fullest extent. It's interesting how many times in our Bible that God uses the idea of eating to illustrate a point. And perhaps there are reasons for that. All people need to eat in order to survive. The better quality of food that you have, the better quality of life you're going to have. And so maybe there's something in the idea of taking something that exists outside of me, separate and apart from myself, and I make it part of me. And it gives me energy in order to sustain me through life's challenges or problems, that sort of thing. Whatever the reason for it, there are a number of places, and this list here is far from exhaustive, of places where God likens food to the spiritual life. And so spiritual life, we even sing the song, all things are ready, come to the feast. And so when he talks about here, let us keep the feast, I don't think he's talking about the Lord's Supper. He's going to deal with that issue later. I don't think he's talking about Passover. He's talking about their whole lives here. Let us keep the feast, your life as a Christian. And so purge out the old leaven. Let's go back to our illustration. Take that sin out of the leaven so that you can be a new lump. You can have a new life in Christ. Do those things that I've told you to do so that therefore you can keep the feast. The entire Christian life is a feast, and we won't read all of these, but I'll leave them up there for those who need to make note of them, but we'll talk about them just for a moment. Luke 14, verse 15, how many times did Jesus talk about being, the bread of life and food being the source there? We need to feed on the source. Talks about eating there. John 6, verse 35, again, several of those instances where Jesus talks of himself being the bread of life, the sustainer of life there. John 6, 53 through 56, he that eats my flesh and drinks my blood. He wasn't talking about the Lord's Supper there either. Sometimes we get that confused. And he wasn't talking about the Lord's Supper. It hadn't been instituted yet. He was far from doing that. He was talking about taking his teachings, which are separate and apart from us, and making it part of our lives, giving us energy that sustains us through life's difficulties, just like a regular, a feast would do. So the person who takes my teachings and makes it part of their life, that person is blessed in his doing. 1 Peter 2, verses 2 and 3, as newborn babes desire the sincere milk of the word. The word there, word of God, is like milk, and we should desire it like newborn children do, and cry and scream until we get it. That should be our desire to have it there. Again, the illustration there, food and sustenance. Hebrews 6 and verse 5, it's worse for those who have tasted salvation and then have left. We get that idea of taste there. They've had part of it, they've eaten, but then they've stopped eating. And again, we get that idea of everyone needs to eat, and we need to do so on a semi-regular basis in order to sustain us. Those who have tasted salvation and have left are worse, the latter end, than the first. And then as well, 1 Timothy 4 and verse 6, he talks about being nourished up in doctrine, having that nourishment of eating that, the doctrine of Christ here. And so for whatever reason, there's a lot of illustration about eating, perhaps because it's so ubiquitous with human experience. Everybody knows it, and everybody has dealings with it. And so maybe that's the case here. But when Paul puts keep the feast here, again, not Passover, that's the old law. It's not something as momentary as the Lord's Supper, but rather it's talking about the Christian life and our eating there. Keep the feast. Be a Christian in a new way by keeping sin out of your life and helping others keep the sin out of their lives. Now, again, he's talking about the church as a whole here in Corinth. He's not talking about just one person doing this. They all needed to do this because sin influenced all of them. I care about you, and so when I know that there's something wrong, I go to you. You care about me, and so when something's wrong, you come to me. And this is how we start to fix it, because we want to keep the feast. We want to be Christians in the right way. So that's the perhaps the idea there, verse 7. And again, I think I've got it there on the screen. All things are ready. Come to the feast. Is that talking about coming to the Lord's Supper? No. Come to the feast and enjoy being the life of a Christian by obeying the gospel. All things are ready. And so grab a plate and let's enjoy life, the life of a Christian. And that's the idea here. So in order to keep the feast the way that they needed to have not the old leaven of acceptance that they had before, neither the leaven of malice or wickedness. When people are engaged in sin and there's the attitude of, well, it doesn't matter, we're going to let them do what they want to do and everybody just kind of go on your own way, that's a problem. And whenever you have those who are angry at other Christians, that's not the right kind of leaven. That's not the right kind of bread or whatever you want to use there for the illustration. And so they had to have a certain kind of elements there present during the Passover. We in our lives need to have the same kind of elements present. The fruit of the Spirit, for example, would be a good thing to have there. And all of those things need to be present. So again, it's not once you're saved, then you just get to decide how you want to live. Nothing else really matters. Life is a feast. The Christian life is a feast. And your choice of food, I guess, if we're using the illustration, matters. It's important. And certainly we need to have the right kind of elements there present in our lives. So therefore, let us keep the feast, not with those other kinds of leaven, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. This is how you have the right kind of life as a Christian. You have one that is sincere. It's based on truth, and it is one that we are doing sincerely. It's not enough to be sincere, but we certainly can't be saved without being sincere. It has to be something that I am honest about. But then it's also based on truth. I would liken this text here to when we're supposed to worship God in spirit and in truth. Spirit there being sincerity. We have that right attitude about it, but it's also spirit and truth. We do the right things in the right way with the right attitude. Same thing for our whole lives. We do the right things with the right attitude. He's going to talk about 1 Corinthians 13 about doing the right things for the wrong reason. Here we see him saying you need to be sincere and have the truth there. So he finishes up that little section, verses 6 through 8 is that illustration that he starts to use, that metaphor that he uses about unleavened bread. So keep those things separate in your mind. What's the Passover and what's the feast and these kind of things. Hopefully that'll help you there through verse 8. Anything that you see there? There's so much here that could be mentioned. Yes, sir, go ahead. Yeah, that's a great point. And I guess my wordiness, I failed to mention that. You say it very succinctly. The Feast of the Unleavened Bread, they were, to sweep the house. All of that leavening agent was to be taken out of the house, removed from there, so they could take of the Passover. And so you have this kind of this image of removing it, cleaning, this kind of thing. Purge it out, take it out, sweep it out, so that you can enjoy the feast there. That's exactly right. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Contamination is a good word. Yeah, a little leaven in Exodus would have contaminated their house, physical house, so that the death angel, even with the blood there, wouldn't have passed over because they didn't obey the whole truth there. The Ten Commandments, the Charlton Heston movie. I remember seeing that as a kid. And it was Joshua, or it was some other person. They had this extra love scene added to the whole movie, and one man cared about this Egyptian woman, and so he went himself with blood, and he was going to put the blood over her door. If I remember that correctly, I may be misremembering something there, but he was trying to obey the gospel for her. As far as I can remember, he put it over the door. That wouldn't work, okay? They had to obey that with sincerity and truth themselves, and they had to do the other things of taking out the leaven there. So a little of it contaminated the whole house, and that's Paul's point here, is that a little leaven that everybody knows about and everybody's okay with, that influences everybody. I'm not saying that we need to be perfect, and any time we sin, we need to be swept out of the church. Far from it. But if we're living in sin, it's habitual for us, and everybody's okay with it, that's where the problem is. And that's what was going on here at Corinth. It wasn't about everybody checking off boxes, and I know that you messed up and you did this little lie this week, so you're gone. No, that's the opposite of what he's telling them here. And so a little leaven, if they knew they had leavening agent in the house and they didn't do anything about it, death angel was coming. They were going to be disobedient. And so they needed to purge that out, and that's what Paul's using for an illustration for what they need to do, because they can't keep the feast otherwise. And so yes, contamination, great word, and that's very, very, very true. Anything else there? Again, whole books have been written on just verse 8 here, so there's a lot that we could mention that I'm failing to do. Verse 5, I wrote to you in an epistle not to company with fornicators. That's interesting. This is 1 Corinthians, and yet we read here of a previous letter that Paul wrote to them. Sometimes I'm a history guy, and so sometimes I'll turn on the History Channel, and you'll see it's regular. Every few months or so, they'll have the lost books of the Bible, or they'll have mysteries of the Bible, and some of those will include books that they don't want you to know about, and that they've been discovered, and some of these other things, and they try to make it all mysterious and stuff. The books that we have, they're the books that God wanted us to have. There's been a lot of studies on that, and there's been no council, of Nicaea that decided what everybody needed to have. By the end of the first century, just about every church of recognizable size had a copy of the New Testament in the way that we do. Any of these newfound books or these new mysterious ones, they're not part of our Bible for a reason. If you were to read them, you would recognize that's not right. That goes against other clear biblical teachings. That's why they're not there. Or they're much older than our New Testament is, or much younger, I guess, in the sense that they were written much later. But there are also letters that were written by apostles that are not in our Bible. Where is this previous letter here that he talks about writing? Well, the answer to that is Paul wrote to them letters when he wasn't inspired. This is an inspired letter that he has right here. 2 Corinthians, inspired by God. It's the same with all the other letters that we have. But when Paul wrote out his grocery list, he wasn't inspired. Anytime he picked up a pen, God wasn't speaking through him. He was a man just like the rest of us. And so there were times when he spoke for God, but there were times when he didn't. And the instances, those occasions were obvious. There were times when Peter spoke for God, but there were also times when he was to be blamed and needed to be withstood to the face, which Paul did there in Galatians 2. And so just because these men were apostles and they were inspired by God doesn't mean that we need to assume that they were like that their whole lives. And so there were occasions when Paul wrote, they were constantly in contact and connect. We think of ourselves with being able to text and get messages to people instantaneously, that we think, well, how did people do it in the past? Well, they communicated the same. We're always the same, and they were constantly writing letters back and forth to each other. And so he wrote to them on another occasion because he cared about them, and one of the things that he told them was, don't communicate with fornicators. Now, the inspired Paul here is remembering that and saying that was absolutely right. We don't have that letter that he wrote first to the Corinthians there. The short answer is because we don't need to have it. We don't have it because we don't need it. If it said everything that Paul said in other letters, we don't need it. And if it said something different or something specific for maybe a person, we still don't need it. We have all things that pertain to life and godliness. And part of our faith has to assume that as well. And so I wrote to you in a previous letter not to communicate or keep company with fornicators. Most of the time we I guess we should talk about the actual point of that, but sometimes when you see that previous letter, sometimes our mind goes wild. It's very possible that there was a letter as well between 1st and 2nd Corinthians. And so our 1st and 2nd Corinthians is probably either, at best, 2nd and 4th Corinthians. And hopefully that confuses you well enough for your day. And so there were other letters that Paul wrote where he was not inspired. But his point in saying that, verse 9, the Corinthians knew absolutely what he was talking about. But his point here was not to keep company, not to have the same kind of relationship with those who are living in sin. Now he uses the word fornicators here, which has those that sell their bodies for lust. And remember, there was that temple, so-called, up on top of that mountain behind Corinth, where prostitutes were priestesses, and you could go up there and worship according to their customs. And so keeping sin amongst yourselves is like a Christian going up to that temple and worshiping, so-called. And so I wrote to you before not to keep company, not to have the same kind of relationship with the world, with fornicators, the same way that you would those of the church. And so it's like they've taken someone who is working, I guess, in that temple, and they've made them part of the church. And he said, this is what sin does. It just gets worse and worse unless it's dealt with. And so I wrote to you before. So Paul's warned them of this before. He warned them when he was present with them, and he has warned them at least once before about why this is wrong and what it's going to do to them. And so they need to be careful, and they need to have the right kind of fortitude and bravery and courage to do what's right, because it's only going to get worse before it gets better. And so I wrote to you in a previous letter not to company with fornicators. Anything there, verse 9. Verse 10, yet not altogether. Verse 10, yet not altogether with the fornicators of this world, or with the covetous, or extortioners, or with idolaters, for then must you needs go out of the world. Paul warned them before, and maybe one of the things he's doing here is he's correcting a mistake he made with one of those other uninspired letters. I wasn't clear enough with this other letter. I told you before not to take company with fornicators, but he says, yet not altogether. Yet not altogether. I'm not telling you that you can't ever be in the same airspace of someone who's a fornicator or extortioner or covetous or idolater or these other things. Maybe there were some who were going to the extreme and saying anyone who's living in sin in the world, I can't be around. I can't be a part of. I need to go live in a convent or some kind of building off in the woods somewhere where I don't have contact with anyone. So Paul, perhaps he's correcting that, and he's saying, if that's what I meant, then you couldn't be in the world at all. You couldn't be with yourself if this were the case. And it very similar to Jesus' prayer there in the garden, where he prayed, keep my people safe from the evil that's in the world. He said, don't take them out of the world, but keep them safe from the evil that's in the world. God doesn't want us to be separate from the world spatially. He wants us to be separate from the world in the way that we act, our attitudes, our lights, our influence. And so we live in the world, but we are not of the world. It's that old illustration. As long as your boat is in the water, everything's okay. But when your water starts to get into the boat, then there's the trouble. There's the problem. And so he's not telling us to take our boat, put it on the dry dock, and don't use it ever. He's saying you put it in the water, but you keep it sealed, and you make sure that it is as it needs to be. And so, I wrote to you before not to company with fornicators, but not altogether. I'm not telling you can't be around any of those. There's a difference between the world and the body of Christ. There's a difference between what the world is doing and what Christians are doing. And again, I said it at the beginning, we spend far too much time, and I have not one single person in this room in mind when I say this, but we spend far too much time talking about and berating and screaming out loud about what the world is doing. And as I've said it before, the world has always been the way that it is. In my mind, it's not getting worse. It's certainly not getting better, but it's not getting worse. We just see more of the sin in the world. And we come up with new ways to sin, and that sometimes gets us excited. But we spend far too much time yelling at the world about what the world is doing, and far less time making sure that we are as we need to be. The world is going to do what the world does. It shouldn't surprise us. It does. But the world shouldn't surprise us that the world is in sin. The world's lost. Jesus said there's a wide gate, and many there be which go in thereat. It's always going to be that way. And so while I'm not saying that we shouldn't, Paul said, have no fellowship with the unfruitful works of darkness, but rather reprove them. We should be letting the world know this is not right. There's a better way. But sometimes it seems like that's all that some people do, is just, here's the bad things that I've heard about on the news this week, and this is all bad, and everything's bad, and it's getting worse. That's not, the Christian is, things are bad, and there's sin in the world, but there's a much better way, and here's some good things, and this is what we need to be involved in. And so certainly he's telling, I think Paul is mentioning that here. Not altogether the world, for then you would need to be out of the world. If we spend so much time saying there's all these things bad and we shouldn't have any contact with the outside world, well, we're going to have to remove ourselves from the world entirely. Be in the world, but rather keep yourself safe from the evil that's there. They were not doing that. They were allowing sin to come into their midst, and it was influencing everybody. And so, yeah, the world's bad. I mean, read some of the historians of the ancient world when they wrote about their Caesars and the things that were there. It will make you shake your head and think, wow, we live in pretty good times. If you were to read about some of the Caesars and the things that they were involved in, the things that were accepted in the ancient world. Today, we would just, wow, there's no way you could do that. And so, yeah, in certain ways, things are worse, things are better. But I think we spend far too much time looking at what the world's doing instead of actually correcting it in our lives and in the lives of the church. Christians need to be that light. And sometimes we focus too much on the darkness, and it'll get you down in a hurry. Focus on the light. Focus on what we need to be doing and shining the light in the right direction. We can reprove the works of darkness in more ways than just pointing it out. It certainly needs pointed out, don't get me wrong. But we need to be spending time doing the things that Christians are supposed to be doing. So not altogether you shouldn't have a relation with them, with the world, but rather reprove them and not let them come into your midst. And so that's the idea there. Verse 10, there's a lot there, but anything else you've got there? Again, if it meant complete separation, then the Great Commission is pointless, useless there. If I can't go into the world and be around those of the world, we've got a problem, because I can't convert them anyway. Go into the world, don't be of the world. Those two letters, very important that we have that there. Anything else? Go ahead.
If you think about it, the way the marketplaces and things like that are designed, with shopping, migrations, and like that. Because you have no idea who might be walking past, who you might be purchasing. That's the point that I think kind of a lot of people I see today point out, it's like, well, I'm not going to buy this specific product because, they support this. I'm not going to go here because they did this, that, and other. That's fine to, try to limit, what your, the money that you spend maybe going towards something, but you can't sit there and dwell on something like that.
Sure.
Not only would I be saying,
And other people, that's very good. Yes. Yeah. I have trouble being consistent when I start thinking in that direction. But there are those who will say if this company, if X company is involved in this, then I'm not sending my money there. And do what you want with your money. It's yours. Be a good steward of it. Don't waste it. Use it properly. I do have to wonder sometimes, though, if the things that we say on, for example, social media or things like this about certain sins, if someone were living in that sin and they only read what I put about it or about those people or whatever, would they feel comfortable coming to me and saying, you know what, I have a problem with this sin and I'd like to know more about Jesus that you claim to serve? Is that what I'm putting out there? Is that what the light that I'm shining there? I should avoid all appearance of evil, and I should avoid showing that I have acceptation of all of these things that are there. If you dig far enough in all of the companies that we all spend money on, there's going to be that approval of sin. Whatever you want to do there is your option. but the way that we present ourselves, more importantly, the way that we present our God. How is that? What does that look like to the world? And you're right, you will drive yourself crazy trying to be consistent in a lot of those things there. So being out of the world spatially and removing ourselves from it, it was impossible for them in the first century, and it's impossible for us. And God's not asking us to do that. How can salt preserve something if it's not in it? How can lighten a room if it doesn't go into the room? And so Christians are supposed to be those who are in the world, but we're supposed to be different, and we're supposed to show that's there. So again, getting back to verse 10 here, perhaps Paul is correcting his wording of a previous uninspired letter by telling them, some of you have gone too far where you won't even go to the marketplace because there are sinners there. And so I'm not telling you altogether, but rather be safe from the evil that is there, for you would need to go out of the world. Verse 11, 12, 13 are doozies. I hate to get into that right here as the bell's about to ring. Anything else up to this point that you wanted to bring out? Again, I hesitated to get involved. We'll blame Andrew, though, since he was the one that brought it up. But anytime you talk about where we send our money, some people, we have scruples about what we do with our money, that sort of thing. But keep in mind what are we actually saying? What are we actually putting out there? What am I advertising as a Christian about what the Christian life is? I have to have a good conscience about what I'm spending my money on and what I'm doing with it, but I also need to make sure that I'm using that money for right and doing the things that I need to do and sending the right kind of message out there. What we put out there, social media, in other ways, is it the life of a Christian? I might ask, if Jesus had a Facebook account, I don't think he would. I don't know. I don't know. He'd look at it and say, that's not for me. But would he put the things that we do about it? Would he say those things there? Yes, ma'am.
You also have to think of what would God do.
Sure.
Yes, it stop people coming up to you on social media, right? And I'm not advertising or anything on social media, but I'm saying you have to think consciously what would God do in those instances or instances, and how he would do going shopping or doing whatever, or whatever it is. Would he stand up towards them, or would he stand against them? So as a Christian, we need to be just like Jesus. And yes, Jesus would, go up to a sinner and shake his hand, but he also would be on our side and support us. You understand?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, he gets into that in chapter 6 especially. What I'm doing, what I'm spending my money on, would Jesus do this? And I have to decide that for myself. I'm not going to condemn someone else for doing it differently, and differently than I would necessarily, but we have to be the light in this world, and sometimes we have difficulty doing that. But yeah, chapter 6, you're right, gets into the having a relationship with the world especially. We'll talk more about that for those who had comments, that sort of thing. That's our second bell. Thank you so much for being here today. We'll have our pick up next time that we're together there. Thank you.